Welcome back to a video series covering all the rules for Riftbound that you need to become an effective judge. This is our 6th video in the series, and we're going to talk about the turn, timing spells and abilities, combat, priority, the chain, everything. We're going to start by talking about game states, which help us determine what cards and abilities we can play or activate at any given time. To start with, the game is always in either an open or a closed state. The game is closed if there is a chain, and open if not. Only cards and abilities with reaction may be played during a closed state. The game is also always in either a neutral or a showdown state. The game is in a showdown state when a showdown is occurring. A showdown will occur anytime a unit enters a battlefield its controller does not control. Usually this happens in the action phase. During a showdown state, only cards and abilities with action or reaction can be played. Let's look at the basic turn structure. The part many players are familiar with is the ABCD to start the turn. That is the awaken phase, the beginning phase, the channel phase, and the draw phase. The main part of the turn is the action phase, and at the end of the turn there is the end of turn phase. The awaken phase is the first part of the turn, and no player may play cards or activate abilities during this phase unless a triggered ability occurs and creates a chain. During the awaken phase, the turn player readies all game objects that can be readied, and then we proceed to the next phase of the turn. The second phase of the turn is the beginning phase, and just like the awaken phase, no player may play cards or activate abilities during this phase unless a triggered ability occurs. The beginning phase has 2 steps. The beginning step is when any at the start of your beginning phase abilities trigger, which includes temporary permanents. And then there's the scoring step. When we get to the scoring step, the turn player holds any battlefield they control, scoring 1 point for each. Hold triggers will happen now after we've scored the point. The next phase of the turn is the channel phase. Once again, no player may play cards or activate abilities during this phase unless a triggered ability occurs and creates a chain. During the channel phase, the turn player channels 2 runes, or as many runes as they can if the rune deck contains fewer than 2 runes. The last player in turn order channels an extra rune in their first turn. After the channel phase is the draw phase, and again, no player can play cards or activate abilities during this phase unless we have a triggered ability causing a chain. During the draw phase, the turn player draws 1 card from their main deck to their hand. And then as this phase ends, each player's rune pool empties of energy and power. The primary reason we empty the rune pool here is so that if a trigger occurs during this beginning part of the turn, a player cannot use that as an opportunity to float 2 energy and 2 power and then recycle those runes and then channel 2 more runes as a result. Once we've moved through the ABCD phases, we get to the action phase, which is the bulk of the turn. The action phase starts with the turn player receiving priority, and priority is just a special term that means that that player has the permission to take what we call discretionary actions. Discretionary actions are the actions a player may choose to take, which separates them from what we call limited actions that can only be done when a card effect or a rule instructs a player to do so, like exhausting cards. Discretionary actions that we can take in the action phase are playing a card, activating an activated ability, hiding a card, or performing a standard move, which may cause a showdown. If the turn player chooses to pass priority in an open neutral state, meaning there's no chain and we're not in a showdown, during the action phase the game proceeds to the end of turn phase, no other player is going to receive priority in the turn. If the turn player hides a card, priority does not change players. If the turn player elects to standard move units, we're only going to have priority changing players if we end up with a showdown or if an ability triggers. Playing a permanent only leads to priority changing if a play ability ends up being triggered as a result of the permanent being played. Remember that the last step of finalizing permanents is to put them directly on the board so they do not sit on the chain waiting to be responded to. We'll cover all of these different triggered abilities in our next video. Now let's talk about chain and priority. Unlike playing permanents, if the turn player plays a spell or activates an ability, this is going to lead to a closed state until the chain becomes empty again. When the player starts a chain, they become the active player and have priority. The active player is simply a designation to mean that in this current state of the chain, they're the player who started with priority. That player may choose to pass priority to the next player in turn order, or they may choose to activate an ability or play a card that has reaction. They will continue to maintain priority until they choose to pass. The only exception to this is an organized play in tournament settings where the tournament rules specify a shortcut that unless the player specifically says otherwise, they are automatically passing priority after they have played a spell or activated an ability. Once again, priority passes in turn order, and if all players pass without adding to the chain, getting back to where the active player would be the next person to receive priority, the last item on the chain resolves. Once a chain item resolves, if the chain is empty, the game transitions to an open state and the turn player has priority. If there are pending items on the chain, they are finalized in the order they are created. Once all pending items, if any, have been finalized, the controller of the last item of the chain becomes the active player and receives priority to continue the chain. Let's imagine a game where Faker is playing against Blabber and Faker is the turn player. As a turn player, during an open neutral state in his action phase, Faker has priority. He chooses to play Singularity. Once Singularity is finalized on the chain, Faker is now the active player and has priority until he chooses to pass. When he passes priority to Blabber, Blabber can either choose to pass priority or play a spell or activate an ability. If Blabber chooses to respond by playing Call to Glory, we finalize the spell on the chain as he pays his costs, and Blabber is now the active player and still has priority. At this point, Blabber can choose to play another spell or activate an ability or pass priority to Faker. If he passes to Faker, and then Faker passes, we resolve the Call to Glory, and then we look back at the next item on the chain, which is his Singularity from Faker. As that is the last item on the chain, Faker is now the active player with priority. If Faker chooses to play another spell, Smokescreen, at this point in time, if Faker chooses to play another spell, Smokescreen, at this time, as it's finalized, Faker will again be the active player with priority. If he passes priority to Blabber, Blabber can then choose to play Hidden Blade to remove his unit and draw 2 cards before Singularity just kills it. Once Hidden Blade is on the chain, Blabber is again the active player with priority as he is the controller of the last item on the chain. If he passes priority, and then Faker passes priority, we will resolve the Hidden Blade and then look at the last item on the chain, which in this case is Faker's Smokescreen. Faker is now the active player with priority. If he passes priority to Blabber, and Blabber also passes, we will resolve the Smokescreen. The last item on the chain is now the original Singularity, meaning Faker is again the active player and has priority. Once he passes, and then Blabber passes, we will resolve the Singularity. There will be nothing left on the chain. The game will transition back to an open state, with Faker having priority as the turn player. An important process to talk about in the middle of all this are cleanups. Cleanups are what we call the process the game uses to tidy up the game state. We perform a cleanup every time the phase of the turn changes, the game state transitions between open and closed, a pending item is finalized on the chain, an item leaves the chain for any reason, a game object enters or leaves the board, a game object undergoes a status change, or a unit moves. During a cleanup, chain items cannot resolve, but pending items can be added to the chain. Generally, this means triggered abilities. A cleanup can cause another cleanup to be needed. If this happens, the new cleanup occurs immediately after the original, and we're going to keep going through cleanups until we go through a cleanup without changing the game state. Special cleanups can occur at other times in the turn, and these have extra steps added on. Currently, the only time these happens are at the end of combat and at the end of the turn. So let's look at the 10 steps of a cleanup. First, if a player has as many points as the victory score, they win the game. Second, we're going to handle outstanding board state, which really just means units that need to be killed. The first part of step 2 is we're going to look for any units that have at least as much non-zero damage marked on them as their might that have death knell triggers. We're going to trigger those abilities, and we're going to make note of the current location, attributes, and anything else about the unit that's relevant to the death knell trigger. The second part of step 2 is any units with at least as much non-zero damage marked on them as their might are killed and put in their owner's trash. Third, if a combat is in progress, we're going to add attacker and defender designations to units at that battlefield, and we're going to remove them from units that are not at that battlefield. Fourth, any uncontested battlefields with no units become uncontrolled. Fifth, we're going to recall gear from battlefields and put hidden cards at battlefields that are not controlled by their controller in the trash. Sixth, we're going to mark a showdown as staged at uncontrolled and contested battlefields. If units from an opposing player are present where we have a showdown staged but the showdown hasn't yet begun, the showdown will cease to be staged. Seventh, we're going to mark a combat as staged at contested battlefields with units from opposing players. If units from opposing players are no longer present when the combat is staged, but before the combat has begun, the combat will cease to be staged. Eighth, we're going to finalize pending chain items. Ninth, if we're in an open neutral state, the turn player will choose a staged showdown to begin. And 10th, if we're in an open neutral state, the turn player will choose a staged combat to begin. So let's talk about showdowns in combat now. Most of the time these are going to happen during the action phase, but they can happen at other times too. When a unit moves into or is played to a battlefield its controller does not control, the battlefield is going to become contested. At the next cleanup, if the battlefield is uncontrolled and no other player's units are at the battlefield, a showdown is going to become staged. and at the next open neutral state, we will begin that showdown. At the next cleanup, if the battlefield is contested and units from other players are at the battlefield, a combat is staged. At the next open neutral state, we will begin that combat. If there are both showdowns and combat staged waiting to begin, showdowns happen first. In cleanup step 9, once we begin a showdown, the game is in a showdown state, and when we reach cleanup step 10 to choose a combat to begin, we're no longer in an open neutral state. In a showdown, the player whose unit caused the battlefield to become contested will begin with focus. Focus is a term that simply means that player starts with priority in an open game state, meaning they have the right to start a chain. Focus passes in turn order like priority, either when the player passes priority in an open game state or when the final remaining chain item resolves and the game state becomes open again. A showdown, and this usually happens only in combat, may include an initial chain from triggered abilities. When the last item of the initial chain is resolving, this is the only time that focus does not pass when we finish a chain. In an open showdown state, only cards and abilities with action and reaction may be played, starting a chain. In a closed showdown state, once a chain has been started, only cards and abilities with reaction can be played. Focus only determines which player begins with priority to start a chain in the open showdown state. Priority will pass as normal when players add items to the chain and as we resolve items from the chain. Again, the player who adds an item to the chain technically still has priority immediately after adding an item to the chain. The assumption in organized play is that they are passing priority after they add an item to the chain unless they explicitly state otherwise. So let's look at an example of a showdown. In our example, Faker has played a sneaky deckhand to an open Zon Warren's battlefield. When we hit the next cleanup, we mark a showdown as staged at this battlefield, and then at the next open neutral state, we're beginning this showdown now. As Faker is the player who caused the battlefield to become contested, Faker is going to start the showdown with focus, which means he will begin with priority in an open showdown state. This means that Faker has the first option to start a chain during the showdown. If Faker chooses to pass priority in the open state without adding anything to the chain, then focus will also get passed. Blabber will then begin with focus and priority, meaning he has the right to start a chain. If Blabber chooses to play a Void Seeker targeting the sneaky deckhand, he will have priority immediately after Void Seeker is added to the chain. Once he passes priority, Faker now has the right to add spells and abilities to the chain. If Faker places a Gust targeting his sneaky deckhand to return it to hand, Faker will again immediately have priority after adding Gust to the chain. When Faker passes priority to Blabber, and then Blabber passes priority, we will resolve the Gust on the chain, and then the last item on the chain is the Void Seeker, so Blabber will begin with priority, and then when he passes priority, and Faker passes priority, we finish the last item on the chain. Just because there is no unit left at the battlefield does not mean the showdown is immediately over. As the last item on the chain resolved, focus will pass back across to Faker. Faker will then have priority with focus to start a chain, and can then play Ride the Wind, targeting his Nocturne to move it to the battlefield. Once all players pass focus without a chain, the showdown will close. If the showdown was occurring as a part of a combat, we'll use the combat rules to finish out the showdown. Otherwise, at the end of the showdown, if only one player's units are remaining at the battlefield and they do not control it, they gain control over it. If they have not yet scored the battlefield this turn, they conquer it and score their point. At the end of the showdown, if units from 2 players are at the battlefield, no player can take control over it. A combat is now staged at the battlefield, and the player whose unit first contested the battlefield is the attacker. Let's look at another showdown example. If Faker moves his Pouty Poro into the uncontested Zon Warren's battlefield, we'll start a showdown. Again, Faker will begin with focus, and then if he passes, Blabber has a chance to act. If Blabber plays a Zenith Blade to target the Pouty Poro, and then move his Leona to the battlefield, we do not immediately start a combat. We're still in the middle of a showdown, and we know that while combats can be staged, they are not begun until we reach an open neutral state, which requires the showdown to end. This means that Leona's shield ability is not yet active to give her +1 might, as we're not in combat and she is not yet defending. This means that as Faker receives focus after the resolution of Zenith Blade, if he has a copy of Void Seeker, he can use it to remove the Leona from the battlefield. If instead, Faker passes priority with focus without starting a chain, and Blabber then passes priority with focus without starting a chain, we will close the showdown, and as there are now units from 2 different players at the battlefield, we will mark the combat as staged. As Faker's unit was the first one to arrive at the battlefield, Faker is the one who applied contested to the battlefield and will be the attacker in the ensuing combat, with Blabber as the defender. So now let's get into the steps of a combat. The first step of combat is a showdown. The attacker in the showdown is the player whose unit contested the battlefield, and the defender is the other player with a unit at the battlefield. The attacker will begin with focus during the showdown. We will immediately assign attacker and defender designations to all the attacker and defender's units at the battlefield. If any of their other units move to the battlefield at a later time during the combat, they will gain their attacker and defender designations during the next cleanup. If any attacker or defender triggers occur, they begin an initial chain to start the showdown, with attack triggers on the chain first before defend triggers. Otherwise, we'll begin the showdown. After the showdown ends, we move to the second step of combat, which is the combat damage step. This only occurs if after the showdown both players still have units at the battlefield. We're going to add the collective might of all of the attacker's units and the collective might of all the defender's units. With the attacker going first, both players are going to assign, but not yet deal, damage to the other's units equal to the total summed mights of their units. Once all damage is assigned, all damage will be dealt simultaneously. Let's go into detail on the assigning damage. Units are assigned damage in an order. A unit must be assigned lethal damage before another unit can be assigned damage. Reminder, lethal damage means non-zero, at least equal to the unit's might. A unit cannot be assigned more than lethal damage unless all of its controller's units at that battlefield have also been assigned lethal damage, meaning you can't overkill one unit to avoid damaging another. Units can have abilities that require them to be assigned damage first or last, such as the tank ability or Caitlyn's ability. If multiple units have the same priority for damage assignment, those units can be assigned in any order before or after other units as appropriate, meaning if there are two units that both have tank and need to be assigned damage first, either of those two units may be assigned damage before the other, but both of them have to have their damage assigned before other units without said ability. As a final note, any unit that cannot be dealt damage is entirely ignored in the process of assigning damage. Once all damage has been assigned and dealt, we'll move to the third step of combat, which is the resolution step. The resolution step begins with a combat cleanup. After step 2 in a normal cleanup, where we look for death knell triggers and then killing units with lethal damage, we're going to insert 3 more steps. We're going to heal all units, we're going to recall attackers at battlefields that still have defenders, which means to put them back at their base. Note, this is not considered a move and does not exhaust the units. And then we're going to remove attacker and defender designations from all units. After we finish cleanups, we're going to remove contested status from the battlefield. If any units remain in a battlefield their controller does not have control of, they gain control. If they have not yet scored it for the turn, that player conquers the battlefield and they'll score their point. This does not have to be the player who applied contested status to the battlefield, meaning that in our previous example where Faker moved into an uncontrolled battlefield, if he lost the combat after Blabber moved Leona in during the showdown, Blabber would then end up scoring a point at the end of combat. And the last thing to talk about in the turn, after the action phase and all the showdowns and combats have occurred, is the end of turn phase. Once again, no player receives priority during this phase unless we have a trigger. The end of turn phase has 3 steps. The ending step is where at the end of turn triggers are going to happen, such as Dazzling Aurora. After the ending step is the end of turn cleanup. This is going to be a special cleanup where we add 1 extra instruction. After we kill all units with lethal damage, we're going to then heal all units. The third step of the end of turn phase is the expiration step. This is when any this turn effects end. At the end of turn phase, the next player now becomes the turn player. And now we've covered everything about the turn, timing, combats, the chain, priority, and we're ready to move into our next video talking about triggers. Thank you for watching and good luck in your studies to become a Riftbound judge. I'll look forward to see you at the next video. In the meantime, like, comment, share, and subscribe for more Riftbound judge content.